Great. So tonight we're going to be talking about beauty. And this is a really hard thing to talk about because I almost feel like one shouldn't talk about it. One experiences beauty, and you almost unweave the rainbow, or at least risk doing so when you try to analyze it into bits. So there's an image from C.S. Lewis that I like to use to think about this. And Lewis says, imagine that you're in this dark tool shed and you can't see anything. It's shadows all around. And then there's this crack up at the top and a shaft of light is just beaming down through this crack. And so there are two modes in which we can experience this beam of light. One is to enjoy the light, as Lewis calls it. And that's when we're sort of standing right in the beam and just seeing everything around awash in this golden glow. And then the other mode of experiencing the light is when you step outside the beam and sort of look along it. So suddenly it becomes intelligible as something that one can hold up for analysis or contemplation. And so when we're talking about beauty tonight, keep that in mind. We're going to be sort of dancing between these two modes of trying to understand the light beam that, let's just say, is a kind of what it means for something or someone to be beautiful. So to maybe stand outside the shaft of light for a moment to try to contemplate it, I think you see a lot of slogans these days about, can beauty save the world? Maybe it's on a tote bag. Originally it was in a Dostoevsky novel, but now we see it, in all sorts of things about the fine arts is what this kind of materialistic utilitarian world needs. This is going to be our refuge from the sort of relentless waves of capitalist acquisition, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't think we can even start to get a grip on the question of, can beauty save the world, until we spend a moment thinking about, well, what beauty is. And of course, there is a long, long tradition of philosophy and aesthetic theory that tries to answer this question. And me, as the insecure grad student, looks at all this and thinks, oh my gosh, no way can anyone read this in a lifetime. So don't worry, we're not going to talk about Kant's third critique or anything like this. But we are going to, I think, draw one helpful line from Pope Benedict XVI's really wonderful book, The Spirit of the Liturgy. And in this, he gives a very brief definition of beauty. Beauty is meaningful inner order. Meaningful inner order. I think it's easy to see what this means if you start to think about kind of characteristic examples of beautiful things. So take a Shakespearean sonnet. There's a kind of inner order to the iambic meter, to the rhyme scheme. Take something like a great symphony or a U2 song, or a great, a statue from Michelangelo or the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. There's a kind of inner coherence to what these things are. They operate by certain rules. Take also beauty as you find it in the natural world. The way that certain sequences of numbers play out in nautilus shells and spiral galaxies. The way that we see the elegance of the physical equations describing the relationship between the speed of light and mass, and even the way that certain planetary orbits overlap to form these really amazing patterns that actually adhere to certain kinds of mathematical ratios that, the old Platonists called the music of the spheres. We look around and the world is just awash in meaningful inner order, which is why you see scientists, poets, mathematicians of both the Christian and the atheistic stripe talk about wonder and talk about this feeling of being transported places when they see something like an open horizon, or even something like, a beautiful sunrise over, say, a sea of clouds. But I think it's worth maybe trying to get a little bit more of a grip on what we mean by these experiences. What are the characteristics they all share? And if we operate with this definition of beauty as meaningful inner order, I think we can tease out three. One, there is a kind of objective quality to these things. This order that seems to inhere in something like a sonnet or a Fibonacci sequence in a nautilus shell is outside of me. It is a certain kind of mathematical pattern that doesn't have anything to do with my feelings. Okay. Second, I think important characteristic is there's something about beauty that's valuable in itself. Something like a painting adorning a wall, or even a beautiful sketch over a doorway. It's not really has any practical use, but at the same time, one can sit almost awash in it and contemplate it and feel somehow more whole or more human by virtue of its being here than, say, if there were just a big black space over the wall. Okay, third big characteristic. I think there is something inherently self-transcending about beauty. So maybe think about a time when you saw a sunrise, or you were looking at, or you heard maybe like the lark ascending, which is something Chris and I have been talking about lately. And you feel sort of moved out of your ordinary experience. Suddenly, the kind of hustle and bustle of the workaday world starts to fall away, and you almost feel lifted up. Your feet leave the earth for a moment. And you're so caught up in this thing that it's only until after the experience has passed that you return back to yourself. So let's call that the sort of self-transcending quality of beauty. So, okay, objective order, 1. The thing being valuable in itself, 2. And 3, a kind of self-transcending quality. I want to add one more, sprinkle of flavor, maybe a cherry on top of this. There seems to be a kind of necessary fittingness between the person viewing the thing and the beautiful thing itself. So, you often hear, well, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. In a way, it's in the encounter of the beholder and the thing itself. Mountains would not be nearly so awe-inspiring to a giant as they would be to people like us, right? You can also think about the way a certain kind of landscape or song means more to you if you have a personal history wrapped up in it. If you're like, oh yeah, I heard that song with my dad or with my grandma, and then suddenly the personal connection with the thing adds more meaning to what would otherwise be, yes, objectively beautiful. But there's a kind of return to the self in the midst of the self-transcendence that happens when there is a certain kind of fittingness between the beautiful thing and the subjective viewer. So this is a sort of good sketch, I think, of the beam as we have it coming through the tool shed. But there is still the remaining question of, okay, great, so we've analyzed why it's awe-inspiring to look at something like Michelangelo's Pietà, but why does that matter? How is that going to save the world? It doesn't address the problem of pain. It doesn't address the problem of wars and suffering. And so there seems to be something more we want, even if we have meaningful inner order. And so I think from there, we're going to now move inside the beam and try to think more about the experience of beauty itself. And this is why I think you often hear people say that beauty is not only something worthy in itself, but it's a kind of way to truth and goodness. It's one of the 3 transcendentals and comes wrapped up in these other 2 essential characteristics of the world, characteristics of being itself. And so this is why you hear things like the via pulchritudinis, literally the way of beauty, the beauty that leads us, say, to truth. And when I hear the word via pulchritudinis, the first image that pops into my mind is like Bishop Robert Barron in front of the rose window in the Notre Dame. He's like, via pulchritudinis, this beauty is going to convert the world and save everyone. Obviously Bishop Robert Barron does not say that, but that's often the kind of message that gets transmitted. And I think that, as I have to say, I do love cathedrals. And if you get a chance, St. Patrick's is beautiful. I don't think cathedrals are the most beautiful thing in the world, I have to say. Being a pilot, I do think that the sky above the clouds is the most beautiful view. But I do think cathedrals give us a really helpful way of thinking about what the via pulchritudinis is and why beauty might be not in and of itself sufficient to kind of redeem the world as we find it, but maybe a way to kind of lead us to something that can. So with that, we're going to start with chapter 1 of A Tale of Two Cathedrals. And we are solidly inside the beam at this point. So back in May of last year, I went on a pilgrimage, as one does. And this was a bit of a crazy pilgrimage. It was to Chartres Cathedral, which is southwest of Paris by about 60 miles. And I did not go alone. I went on the traditional annual pilgrimage with what ended up being close to 24,000 other pilgrims by the end of it. We all started in central Paris and then walked in this massive snake, like, I don't know, 2 miles long, all the way to Chartres. And it was 60 miles in 3 days. The average age of the pilgrims was like 20, something ridiculous. There were so many young French scouts. We were singing, we were sleeping in fields, we were, eating soup at 10 o'clock at night, having walked 25 miles the day before. And we were all on our way to see what has been commonly called the most beautiful cathedral in Europe. So we arrive in the middle of a hot afternoon to Chartres, this amazing high Gothic French cathedral built in the 12th and 13th centuries. And, it just kind of rises up from the horizon. You walk all the way there, and then boom, it hits you. If there were any such thing as via pulchritudinus, Chartres would be it. And I think that if there were a place that best sort of embodied what we mean as beauty as meaningful inner order, Chartres would be the place. It is famously built as a kind of high point of the medieval cosmos. The medieval cosmos that saw the world as perfectly described by certain mathematical relationships. It saw all things as a symbol in the book of nature. And there's a certain, in this sort of perspective, a certain correspondence between scenes or important episodes in theological and biblical history and nature of the world itself. And so you see this, for example, in the west entrance to Chartres, which has 3 great portals. One, Christ's incarnation, one, Christ's ascension, and then one in the middle, his second coming. And you see all around the 12 apostles interlaid with the 12 zodiac signs, over the 24 elders from the book of Revelation, 12 being the number of earth meeting heaven, heaven the number 3 of the perfect triangle and the unity of 1 finding its return back to the origin in 1, 4 being the number of humors in the body, seasons of the year, elements in the world, etc. So you can start to see how all of these geometric patterns replay themselves in a perfect, tight, static harmony all throughout Chartres, and these thousands of sculpted figures. And it's a little overwhelming to walk in and say, like, wow, it's beautiful, but I can't really see how this amazing inner harmony that's certainly objective, that certainly exists for itself, and that certainly sort of calls me up out of myself, where does it leave room for my own kind of entering into it? The fact that this amazing Gothic cathedral exists, what does it mean for me and my problems? And like how I'm going to go off and go back to Oxford and live a meaningful life. And there were so many people there for this pilgrimage that they were celebrating Mass at like high noon. And none of the pilgrims actually got to go inside. I think only the youngest did. And so it was a kind of a good picture of what was going on, because it's like, wow, here's all this beauty up for my contemplation. And yet somehow my personal life feels isolated. It feels kind of on the outside. And I remember looking up, and the moon was rising particularly early that day. And so I saw it kind of up here, all pale and lonely in the bright blue sky. I was like, what I would really like would be like a cathedral on the moon. Like, that would be pretty cool. Maybe I could personally enter that in a way that I can't really encounter Chartres. So that was our first cathedral. Let's move on to the second. Now it's December. And this is the way that my friend and I got to this cathedral is about as opposite as the way we got to Chartres as one could get. If that was a traditional pilgrimage celebrating its 41st year, this was my friend and I being so exhausted at the end of the Oxford term that we just hop on Skyscanner and we're like, okay, where are the cheapest tickets out of here? And it just happened that it was to Barcelona. And so we fly, on like a Friday out of Stansted and rock up in Barcelona. And of course, it's raining. We bring the UK with us in our attempt to escape the clouds. And we start just exploring the city. And as we're walking down the main street, La Rambla, I look up and I see this crazy house off to the side that looks like it's fallen out of some sort of like Dr. Seuss book. It's like a rounded ceiling with dragon scales and all these amazingly frosted metalwork on the side. I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this thing is real. It looks like it's dropped out of some sort of fairy story. We keep walking around the city, and there's another house of a similar style called the Pedrera. We keep walking, and then we walk through a park, and it's called Park Güell, and we're seeing all of these amazing ceramic curved benches, a lizard coming out of the steps leading up to the high point of the park, these amazing stone columns that look like they're waves crashing out of the side of the hill. And then I start to see all these like little shout outs to Catholic iconography. There's a salve over here, a reference to the Virgin Mary over here. It's very strange. What's going on? So then the last day in Barcelona, my friend and I decide that we have to go check out this place that everyone is telling us we should go check out, and it's called the Sagrada Familia. Like, okay, cool. So we walk up out of the tube stop, or I guess the underground there. I turn around, and I just, like, the Sagrada Familia hits me. And I'm like, wow, I think that if there were a cathedral built on the moon, it would probably look something like this. And so I have a book here that I'll leave out for the Q&A, but here's a glimpse. I don't know if anyone's familiar with this great church built by Antoni Gaudí, but my friend and I walk in, and I'm just sort of aghast because it's almost, it feels like something out of a dream. And it's a Gothic cathedral essentially turned inside out with all of the sculpted figures in a kind of Art Deco style on the outside. And then you walk in and you feel like you're in this great forest of stone. And there are these amazingly helicoidal curves around the towers on the inside. And then even looking down the stairwells, you see the same great spirals that you see in nautilus shells and galaxies in the spiral shape. And it's just amazing to me because I felt walking around that place, it was so idiosyncratic. I felt like I was eavesdropping on Antoni Gaudí's prayer. What kind of relationship with God did this architect have to inspire something like this? If Chartres was the perfect picture of a kind of objective, meaningful inner order, then this was something else entirely. It was sort of like all of the great principles that led to the catenary arch, that led to these amazing towers and the same objective story, and yet put in such an amazing personal key. What's going on? So I started looking more into Antoni Gaudí's life, and it's fascinating. He was born in 1852, south of Barcelona, was a sickly child with rheumatism, and so he didn't go out and play with the other kids, but it gave him time to observe the nature and the way that the sun would rise over the Mediterranean Sea. He goes to Barcelona and studies architecture. He loses a brother and his mother at a young age, and he starts to really hone his craft. He's a big shot, he starts to dress like a dandy and walk around with this perfect hairstyle and ride the carriage to the opera, and everyone is thinking like, wow, this is the guy. He gets assigned the Sagrada Familia, or he takes it on as a project to work on when he's 31 and spends the rest of his career working on this church. And, at this time in Barcelona, everything is kind of caught up in the Catalan Renaissance. And so a lot of people are struggling and sort of working towards defining Catalonia's artistic and national identity. And so there's a story of the King of Spain coming to observe Gaudí's work on the Sagrada Familia, and Gaudí refuses to speak to him in Spanish and speaks directly in Catalan. And he has to have a translator there to speak to the king, just to give you a kind of sense of how engrossed he was in this project. So then, right around 1909, when Gaudí is like in his 60s, his life starts to take a pretty drastic turn. There are a series of violent outbreaks between sort of Catalan resistance fighters and the Spanish crown. And the next decade of his life, Gaudí loses key friends and key collaborators and a dear niece. And of financial crisis puts a pause on his projects, Park Güell, as well as the Sagrada Familia. And Gaudí is essentially, having never married, devoted himself completely to his craft, finds himself really alone in the world. And he says, "My good friends are dead. I have no family and no clients, no fortune, nor anything. Now I can dedicate myself entirely to the church." So this one dandy essentially turns ascetic. He starts caring nothing at all about his physical appearance. He gets this shaggy white hair. He's walking around with tattered clothes. He's sleeping in the crypt of the Sagrada Familia. And he's pouring everything into building this church that he knows very well he will never see completed. And he walks every day to Mass. He takes the same route. And he's fasting, he's in prayer. He fasts so drastically that he comes close to dying on a few occasions. And one day he's taking his typical route along the street to the Church of St. Philip Neri for his daily prayer and confession. And he gets hit by a tram car bumbling through the street. And he's laying on the side of the road. And people in the city that he helped build are just walking by because they see his tattered clothes and they think he's a beggar. So a day passes by, and then finally some passerby looks down and is like, "Oh my gosh, this is Antoni Gaudí." And so they pick him up and take him to a nearby beggar's hospital. But by the time he's there, it's too late and he ends up dying of his injuries. And he is to this day buried under the crypt of the Sagrada Familia, which continues incomplete 142 years after it was officially started. And to this day, it's the cathedral of the poor. It's the visitors who come in to pray in this amazing space who are sort of paving the way toward its completion. And even the architects who have sort of carried on Gaudí's work and are determined to take his vision to completion, there are stories of many of them converting to the Catholic Church. They're so inspired by the kind of life that this architect lived. And Gaudí's beatification cause is up and running, and there are many people working on this today. God's architect, as he has come to be called. And I realized the more that I looked into this story that beauty didn't save the world necessarily, but it did save Antoni Gaudí's soul. So what does it mean for a human life to be beautiful? What does it mean for a human person to find a kind of meaningful inner order in themselves? How do I fit in with my picture of the world? And so if we're going to step out of the beam right now and do another bit of contemplation, I think it's helpful to do it with a quote from Gaudí. And he says, "La originalidad consiste en acercarse, en retornar al origen." Originality consists in approaching and returning to the origin. And so there are many ways we could take this question. What is the origin of the modern world as we find it, historically speaking? What is the origin of the human person, or even myself as I understand myself existentially or experientially? What makes me happy? What is the deepest part of me? What is my sort of route to authenticity? We could even ask this metaphysically. What is the primary cause? Why is there something instead of nothing? Why does there continue to be something at all? And I think if we start to ask these questions deeper and deeper, the cross of Christ starts to loom rather large, just as it did in the life of Antoni Gaudí. I think you start to realize historically that a lot of the sort of prized possessions of the modern world, historically speaking, find their origin in the person of Christ, whether it's equality, the idea of human rights, even the intelligibility of the world understood through modern science. It's amazing how many secular historians are catching on to this story. So I'm thinking of people like Tom Holland and his book Dominion, or even someone like Larry Siedentop. Then if we ask the question, anthropologically, when am I happiest? Why does it seem to be an important ingredient of authenticity, that I transcend myself and become something more than who I am today? Why am I happiest when I'm living in human community and giving myself to other people? It's interesting that even Richard Dawkins, the famous old new atheist at this point, talks about calling himself a cultural Christian, insofar as he doesn't believe a word of Christianity, but recognizes that the world works best when people operate with a certain kind of Christian ethics. And he also said that he would never want to get rid of the cathedrals and beautiful parish churches around this country. And that's actually like a couple days ago at the Catholic Herald, interestingly enough. But yeah, and then you start to realize even metaphysically that in these big questions, there's been a tradition thinking about these things and a sort of unbroken line, for about 2,000 years. And so I think if we start to analyze this worldview centered around the cross as if it were a stained glass window, and we started to think about the sort of categories of beauty that we found earlier, we start to find that meaningful inner order centers around Christ on the cross. Christ, the Logos, that we hear at the beginning of the Gospel of John, is the word through which all things were made, the kind of underlying ratio for all of the great geometric patterns beautifully on display in a cathedral-like chart. Christ, one person of the Trinity, which is perfectly complete in and of itself, and the creation of the world as pure gift, coming from that amazing love, the dance of the three persons of God, with the end of all creation being to simply be in loving relationship with the Father. And finally, Christ on the cross as the model of self-transcendence, who emptied himself out to become a human person, to die for his friends, and to set an example for other people to pick up their own crosses, their own missions, to give themselves the way that someone like Antoni Gaudí did, to lead other people back to the same cross. With this idea of self-transcendence becoming the meaning of all things, so that we, by picking up our own cross and carrying forward our own missions, could achieve a self-transcendent union with Christ, and through the life of grace coming back with the rest of creation and all things to the Father. And to think that the meaning of all things is a person, with the kind of personal encounter that can marry the great objective inner order and the great personal vision of these two cathedrals in one lover of souls, whose name is Jesus. God saves. It's hard to think of a way of seeing the world more beautiful than that. So I think for a final word, it might be worth thinking about what it would mean to step inside the being. And I think that a lot of times we think that beauty is something that anyone, anywhere, at any time can see, when in reality, there has to be, I think, a certain kind of adequacy between the viewer and the thing being viewed. So sometimes there are some things so beautiful that we have to become certain kinds of people to be able to perceive. And which is why when we're thinking about something like the truth of Christ crucified, it's almost as if we have to become the kind of people who can learn to see God in all things. And this is something that, we can only do by asking. So there is something true about trying to see if this is an adventure that I really want to go on, knowing that as soon as I embark in it, I'll never see the world quite the same way again. So yeah, with this, I would say, if anything, maybe the Via Pulchritudinis is a good excuse to ask for the grace, to step inside the light, and then to come and see. Thank you.